Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Blue Room. Today we'll be discussing net zero from the point really of what it means in practice rather than in theory. What is net zero and what does it mean to your businesses? And we'll be digging a little bit deeper beyond our own businesses into really going to the ground level, architecture, buildings, and the like. So Raj and Jamie and Mark will be discussing this topic about which they know an awful lot more than me. I will be bringing them onto the stage in a minute for introductions. Please do, if you have questions, if you have comments during the broadcast, please do post them in chat, and also if you're watching on the recordings, please make comments. So here we go. Hi everyone, this is me, and welcome everyone. So Jamie, Mark, Raj, if you could possibly introduce yourselves. Jamie, if I could turn to you first, please. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Jamie Bishop. I'm a director of an architecture practice called Fleet Architects, based in London, headquartered in London. We work across a large range of sectors, but so we can bring influences from different areas. But we have quite a strong stream of work in hospitality and presently looking at all scales in the hospitality sector, from the very small boutique to some really quite large, quite high-tech off-site solutions as well. You're silenced, Richard.
Thanks. That could have taken a long time if you hadn't said that. Mark, over to you, please.
Yeah. Hello, it's Mark Harris, Director of Horden MEP. We're MEP Services Consultants. We are based in Faversham in Kent. And again, we cover all main sectors really. We do an awful lot of work in sort of educational, residential, multi-residential, hospitality, and healthcare, with things like GP practices and such like. All scale of projects are covered, and quite topical. We're really getting into a few zero carbon schemes at the moment with local authorities. So good time to be in the sector.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, there's another phrase, isn't it? Zero carbon. I'm going to be having a lot of questions here, a lot of basic questions perhaps, but yeah. Raj, over to you, please.
Hello everybody, my name is Raj Randhawa. I'm the CEO of AV Quest. We're a payment solution, and we provide a lot of systems to hotels and service department providers. However, from the purpose of this discussion, I'm actually here based on work I've done in the past. I was IT director at Think Apartments and Sunlight Projects, where we actually built 1,000 apartments or thereabouts in London. And a lot of the ideas that were considered and some of the things we implemented I believe actually can contribute towards this discussion, and also help to provide a practical element that I'm sure Mark and Jamie will bring to the fore.
Fabulous. Thanks, Raj. Thanks, Jamie and Mark. Question really is, where do we start with such a big topic? If I may, I will start with a very basic one, and I don't know who would like to explain this one to me. What does net zero, net carbon mean? Is there any kind of simple definition?
Can I nominate Mark for the initial answer on that one?
Right, okay, so I'll refer to the definition as defined by the World Green Building Council. as being highly efficient with all remaining energy from on or off-site renewable sources accounted for. This means the total carbon emissions associated with a building's usage and construction must be equal or negative. Does that summarise it?
Kind of, yeah. It does summarise it, but equal or negative to what? Is that a...
So yeah, any emissions effectively. So you have to be either completely equal, so you do not emit any carbon emissions, i.e. by the production of on-site energy or from off-site sources. Obviously, you're very unlikely to be perfectly zero. So, you know, ultimately the target, most buildings will be negative in some way.
Can I ask a quick question on that, just to sort of clarify? So, I mean, obviously, one of the things is that we have amongst our audience, I know we have people from the States as well, and other countries, Germany, etc. The approach that's taken in the UK, or the definition you've given, is that an international standard, or is that being adopted by everybody, or is it maybe slightly different elsewhere?
So certainly you've got your various international bodies such as SIBSI, ASHRAE, and such like, but the World Building Council, they certainly sort of advise on to a number of these public bodies, and I think that's the sort of most recognised standard presently. And certainly in terms of, I know a lot of people would be thinking, well, you know, I really can't see how my building can achieve carbon neutrality, certainly from on-site sources, and no doubt it will come up in conversation a bit later, you know, in this hour. But you know, there's going to have to be a lot of sort of visual looking to off-site, you know, in energy, so that will be from green energy sources, central. You know, you get your green energy tariffs now. There's going to be a lot more of that coming on, and you know, a lot of these buildings, limited roof space where you can't generate your own energy and stuff like that. They will be looking more and more to off-site sources to achieve their carbon neutrality.
I think the difficulty is, and why I sort of rather cheekily kind of posted it Mark's way as a question, is that the interpretation is open to a huge degree of variation depending on where and how different jurisdictions choose to apply it. I think that the also I think that there's this sort of sense that what we're talking about is sort of what we're going to do, what's going to happen, what we need to do in the future. And actually, I think there's another side to this, which is reflecting on the buildings that we have. And there's I think that while historically there's been a lot of focus on quite overt sort of green techniques to make buildings and make the built infrastructure greener, I think now going forward, we're going to have this much more holistic view of the energy and the embodied energy of buildings, which means that actually existing buildings are, I mean, there's a phrase which is bandied around a lot. The greenest building you have is the greenest building is the one you already have. So actually, the fact is most people will have, the audience here, I'm sure most people are either own or running or managing assets. And I think probably the first thing to do is to understand what the class carbon-wise is of the existing building you have. And that includes the embodied energy, because then that can be used to offset against any future demands as well. Because if you choose to renovate or reuse existing assets, the burden should not be as much as, for instance, if you were building afresh, because of somewhere between 50 and 2/3 of the energy use of a building in its lifetime comes from its fabrication and its installation. So it's not all bad news, but I think there is a whole lot of homework that people need to do to understand the buildings that they have in this way, and potentially to limit themselves to what they have to do in the future, if that makes some sense.
Yep, indeed. Thank you. Thanks for that, Jamie, Mark, Raj. Welcome, by the way, to viewers. Veronica, thanks for posting and thanks for coming along. I know that this topic's very close to Veronica, so I'm sure that there's going to be some questions that she'll have. And please, in the audience, do also post your comments and questions. What I'd like to ask, well, a few kind of questions here, all combined, really. I mean, net zero, is it common across countries, so or geographical regions? Is it common across industries as well? So do we all have to play to the, is there a level playing? Where are we? We'll keep getting feedback there. And is there a legal framework involved? So, are you either net zero or not net zero? And then there is a certification as such to define that. So just to recap on that, really, common across countries, ? Common across industries, ? And whether there is a certification involved. And I don't, anybody who likes that.
Could I go first on that, Richard? So in terms of common across regions, well, there are only a few outliers internationally of countries that haven't committed to net zero by 2050. There are many that have committed to achieving that beforehand. The detail of how that's going to be achieved is yet to fall out. But so I think that the general message is that almost universally it does apply. That's, I think, sort of a short answer, but not particularly comprehensive answer to your first question. The second question was, just remind me, Richard, sorry?
Across industries.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to dodge that one slightly because I think that I think because we're still waiting to see how it falls out in terms of regulation in different countries in lots of ways. But what we do know, things that are universal, again, we do know that energy isn't going to go down in value. Right? That's universal. Everyone's going to be dealing with that. So if we're not being hit by the stick of regulation, we're going to there's the carrot of saving money. Running your buildings, which is really key. So that is universal. I think that the other aspect is that increasingly, and because we're talking to people who are running commercial operations, the universality of what people will expect to see in terms of what the optics are as a company, whether and I think that's something which, in the way that when we buy a refrigerator, we know what environmental performance it comes with. I think that increasingly that will be a measure of a service you buy as well, and service offered. So that's something that I think will come in with regulation and possibly much earlier. I mean, we're seeing energy issues already. Okay. And the third part of your question, Richard, sorry.
Certification.
Oh, certification. I think, again, because of the lack of clarity across different areas about regulation, it being an evolving feast, I think there's actually going to see some things, some universal ideas start to develop as well. I think this idea of a building class, like a net zero building class, like the idea, and that could be something which could be applied to a new building, which could be relatively straightforward, but also is quite an exciting idea when you start to look at existing estates. So you could start to reevaluate your existing estate and take it to that net zero as well, and help you. And it gives you kind of a model to which you can manage your portfolio.
Perfect.
If I can just add a couple of things there, and this is really from a business perspective within hospitality. After COP26, there were a number of announcements, and one of them I remember was Booking.com, and I think Expedia also said that they were going to actually start promoting those hotels that were net zero ahead of those that weren't. Obviously, we have to see how that plays out, but the business reasons for actually at least moving along a net zero path, it's not just about the energy that you save, and obviously you all want to reduce our energy costs, but also from a business perspective in hospitality, the actual avenues of revenue in terms of the OTAs, etc., becoming, you might find if you're not actually doing something, that might inhibit you from actually getting business. So it's important that everybody have a strategy at least to actually show people that they are on that path and not just ignoring it.
I mean, in a parallel, I think we talked about drawing from other industries as well. So in a parallel sector, we're looking at frameworks now that to get onto frameworks, we need to present our pathway towards net zero, and that's in public procurement. So this is starting to happen already.
Just maybe sort of wrap that up from our side. The Carbon Trust, which is obviously quite active in the UK, they have a certification scheme that follows the international standard past 2060 for carbon neutrality, and that sets out the requirements for quantification, reduction and offsetting of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's been in play for a little bit, and obviously there's a lot of fallout from COP26 at the moment, and certainly in the UK, from my side, the long overdue Part L updates are due within the next 12 months, and I would expect that there is a more formal type of classification that we'll see come out, because there's going to be a lot of people that want to shout about their new carbon zero building. They've achieved it, therefore they want to be at the forefront, whilst a lot of other people are naturally catching up. So yeah, in terms of sort of direct certification, that's sort of one of the few we're aware of at the moment, but I'd expect to be seeing a lot more come forward in the near future.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And you mentioned there about people mentioning net zero, and I would like to give a shout out for the Lamington Group and Hotel Room 2, who have broadcast that they are the first net zero hotel. They're based in their new property in Chiswick. So actually, whilst we're talking more closely about on hospitality side of things, am I right in understanding that another sector, and this is namely so hospitals and care homes, are leading the way more, or not necessarily leading the way, that they're ahead of hospitality? And is that an area where hospitality, hotels can borrow from that sector, or have I misunderstood that, please?
I could take this, but I jumped in first last time. If Mark wanted to go first, no, I'll follow on.
Certainly, where something is centrally funded, then there's more and more obligation for these projects to be, aspiring to be zero carbon from the outset. But very quickly, we are seeing more private sector projects following suit, for reasons already outlined by Raj and Jamie. If people can say that they are net zero, they are carbon zero, carbon neutral, whichever buzzword they want to use or whichever way they want to paint it, that is what people are looking for now. So if it's a hotel group and people want to make a booking, they feel good about making a booking in that kind of property. So yes, there is certainly an element of central funded projects leading the way in some regard. I mean, there's not too much crossover in a lot of the systems on our side, certainly, but it's across the board now. We've gone from seeing not very much at all to most inquiries coming in. How can we do this? What's it going to involve? And I don't know, Jamie, if you sort of looking at more embodied carbon side at all, from your side, but certainly on the systems, it's very much renewable centric at the moment.
I mean, I think that probably where, other than where regulation is changing how centrally funded, so government funded projects are setting targets. So for instance, with many people will be familiar with BREEAM targets, and that can have interplay with planning and zonal requirements. But I think one of the most interesting things that we're seeing in public buildings, which perhaps it could feed in more to the private sector, is because of the early adoption of the need to get towards new targets. We're looking at implementation as well. So looking at how, if you've got an estate which in itself doesn't have that much spare capacity within it, and that needs to keep operating while still delivering the services that it's there to provide, but needs to be upgraded and changed significantly. It's how you set about planning that life cycle process of be it technological or technical advances within the buildings or improvements on the fabric as well. So I think we can't, and this is, I think, is a very important part of looking at buildings in the future. This is not a static issue. This is not about sort of buying an off the shelf kind of certified green product. It's about running it in a way which is sustainable as well. It's about the husbandry of the building. It's I mean, I think this is where sort of a lot of Raj's experience is really interesting. You think of the, how it's sort of intelligent management of the buildings, and how what we would call from a technical side, the BMS speaks with your PMS, and that interrelation about how you manage the buildings, I think is really interesting. And that's, I think, where the public sector is sort of slightly more advanced at the moment, but partly because of the way that the rules are being implemented early, and that's certainly something we'd like to see sort of brought over.
Yeah, just going back to that point. I mean, if I give an example, so when we started the actual construction work for Sunlight Projects, by the time the first building had simply been constructed, but no work had been done to actually within the building, just because we just demolished buildings, we then constructed the building, and we just got the outer shells. While that work was going on, I was working with the owner of the organization on the next step of work after the whole thing had been put together. So we were already working on refurbishment ideas even before we started actually building out the actual internal shells of the building. And the reason for that was, one, we wanted a continuous improvement program in place. So it was never going to be the situation where we said we were happy. It was always going to be, we do things in steps. We get the buildings up and running as quickly as we could. We make sure that revenue is generated, but we never lost sight of the fact that there was a continuous improvement program in place. And that also meant that we could think about how to wire the buildings. So you'd wire them in a particular way, knowing that some of that infrastructure was going to be used as part of as a result of the refurbishments, not as part of the initial construction. And that whole thought process, one, it meant that we could actually pick and choose suppliers in a particular way, and we had a lot more control. But the other part of it was that we could take on new ideas as they were coming to the market. And that, and I think that's that whole approach of treating it like a program, a big infrastructure program, paid significant dividends to enabling us to mitigate for issues that arose during construction. But it also meant that we already had in place ideas to resolve problems that maybe we're better off dealing later, rather than putting on the shoulders of the people who are doing the construction work.
Can I add to that? I think this is really key. I think the idea of loose fit in what you design. Sorry, there's an ambulance going past our office. So loose fit sort of is a phrase that's bandied around quite a lot by designers. It's where you design for what the specification, the performance you need right now, but then you provide a certain amount of capacity for change and flex in the future. Now, the way that interplays with zero carbon is really interesting because of the penalties that are applied to new build. I mentioned earlier about the embodied energy of building a new building. So what you don't want to be doing is have do what we maybe were doing 20, 30 years ago, where we were saying a building had a expected lifespan of 30, if you're lucky, 60 years. And then at the end of that, it kind of disappears and you replace it with another. That's out of the window now. We've got to be designing for buildings to last for an awful lot longer than that. So we've got to, we need to look into crystal balls, but we're never going to know. There's unknown unknowns. So we do need to build in this idea that buildings can accommodate a whole raft of changes which we might not be aware of. So that's things like looking at things like spans that are flexible for lots of different interpretations, and also building in capacity, latent capacity, if not that uses energy, but it gives you the opportunity to adapt and change. And because we can't go back to the bad old days where when a building became redundant, as Raj was saying, you just knock it down and replace it, because the penalties will simply be too high.
Yeah, thanks everyone for that. Thank you. I'm actually proud of myself that I'm still here. When I heard the siren, my gut reaction was to run. So it's old habits die hard. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. You mentioned earlier, Jamie, that saying about the best building is the building you've got, kind of thing. New builds, refurbishments, is there then a tendency to refurbish rather than new builds? And if that's the case, how do you go about introducing the kind of materials into the buildings that help you to be net zero? I'm thinking of course in terms of wood, and furniture, wood in the construction, perhaps furniture as well. But yeah, I won't overcomplicate the question.
I mean, I think the timber one is probably more applicable when we talk about new build, because when you use a material like wood, it has sequesters carbon in itself is already negative, so it's a huge advantage in new build. But I think dealing with the existing buildings first, I think is really the complicated question. I think Mark will have a view on technology, and that has a huge part to play in it. But there are some fairly basic kind of approaches first that we need to look at. I think Mark will agree. I think air tightness. Our historic buildings are incredibly leaky. So actually improving air tightness of buildings, which means that and then you can look at the heat recovery of any of the exhausting of air, or even other heat sources. So water, hot water that leaves a building, we can look at recovering heat from those. But there's little point in doing recovering heat from those if we're allowing heat just to escape out of so many holes. So the idea of achieving air tightness is really key. And that's whether your energy burden is for heating or for cooling. Air tightness allows you to manage the energy consumption to control the temperature inside a building. The fabric as well, so upgrades to the fabric, and that could be around increasing insulation would be the most common one that people would understand, but also increasing thermal mass. So if you increase the thermal mass of a building, and there are various ways you can do this, particularly in specifying one insulation over another, you can essentially, instead of having a building which is subjected to sort of sinusoidal changes in temperature through the day, if you can increase the thermal mass and you can use that as a heat sink, you can level that out, and the building then requires less heating or cooling to get to where it needs to be to level off. Now, it's really hard to look at anything like this while you're managing and operating a building where cash flow is king, and you can't take a building offline. So I mean, I think that's the thing where sitting back and putting together a strategy is really important. And I think you've got to look at integrating this kind of work within a sequence of life cycle work that you'd be doing anyway. So you don't want to, and that's where you can't really get away from it, but you can, if you do factor it into life cycle work, you can certainly limit the impact. I think I mentioned earlier about management of the building, which I think is key in bringing technology in there. But I mean, I don't know if Mark, if you want to say something about in terms of actually the technical side of providing heat and coolth and heat recovery and where that's going. I think lots of people will have heard in recent months in this country the phrase heat pumps, but be quite kind of confused by what that means as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as Jamie's alluded to, improving any existing building on the fabric side and air tightness is key to reducing the emissions that building has. But of course, the immediate drawbacks are, as soon as you make a building airtight, you need to introduce ventilation. So again, in some buildings, that's not always the easiest thing to achieve. You might have limited ceiling voids or no ceiling voids at all, listed facades, etc. So there's always good ideas, but often hurdles to overcome at the same time. But yes, in terms of certain technologies, there's many ways. Obviously, the government is really pushing heat pumps. The primary reason for this is the sort of reluctance to provide new buildings with gas connections in the very near future. That's certainly going through government at the moment to sort of finally legislate that with actual dates and processes. Certainly on the residential side, there's a real desire to not have any new builds provided with a grid gas connection. And the only real logical way to deal with that is with air source heat pumps in most instances. If it's not air source, it could be ground source or water source, but they all act in the same way. They extract heat from something, be it air, water, the ground, and provide a heat output from that. The heat pumps are very efficient. You can get between 300% and 500% efficiency from that, and you get your sort of low grade heat for the house. Now, whether that's to provide a heated body of water, your heating is derived from that, your hot water is derived from that, albeit with some form of top up. Although it's a buzzword at the moment, of course there are drawbacks with heat pumps, particularly with older buildings. They really work well with a lovely new building that's airtight and very thermally efficient. They don't work so well with older buildings that are leaky and don't have particularly good insulation. You will find that the heat pump is fighting the building the entire time and is incapable of providing enough heat output to counteract the heat lost from the building. So really, when looking at heat pumps, it's going to be a program of insulating and improving all of the facade elements, be it windows, doors, envelope, and really knuckling down on the air tightness. Once that's done, obviously you've got a very, very efficient platform to work with, and then you can introduce further elements for additional savings. Jamie's alluded to wastewater heat recovery, for example. This works very well in extracting heat from wastewater. You've got the ventilation heat recovery systems, which are incredibly efficient. They will withdraw most of the heat from the extracted air and supply onto the supply air into the building. I just think there's an awful lot of almost too much emphasis on pushing for this heat pump drive at the moment, and not enough background information that most people are aware of, with the sort of secondary elements that need to be dealt with on their existing property portfolio to sort of incorporate it. People sort of go, yep, great, we'll have a heat pump, we'll get this building running efficiently. They don't tend to understand that there's significant additional costs that they need to be aware of, that need to be really thought about, designed, planned, to get the building ready for a heat pump in the first place. It's certainly not something you can just retrospectively change a gas boiler for example. And the secondary effects of making the building more efficient in terms of envelope and lack of heat loss through air infiltration requires a need for additional mechanical ventilation to be considered. So there's an awful lot of consideration for this sort of heat pump solution.
Mark, I mean, we've always found and always lent on the side that that the best solutions often aren't the most glamorous ones, or the sort of big ticket ones. They're the ones that sort of need to be carefully considered and installed. But I think looking at one very practical one going forward, where in areas, I was conscious that we've got an international audience, but in areas where gas heating, water-based gas heating is the norm, what is the process of switching over towards, for instance, using electrical heating rather than gas heating, and is that something that is more achievable or more practical going forward?
Yes, I mean you can easily substitute any gas heating for electric heating. I mean the biggest change is obviously demand and load on the building. I mean, certainly in the UK, most domestic supplies are single phase, for example. They're 230 volt up to 100 amp single phase. Internationally, that may change a bit. In some countries, certainly there's a lot of three-phase supplies that go into properties. I think there's there's got to be a degree of caution in changing some of these sort of systems over. Grid capacity, not just at the building itself, but local network capacity. But in terms of actual kit within the building itself, you might have a gas direct fired heater or gas combi boiler. If you've got electric heating, again, it's likely to be some sort of vessel of water with an electric immersion. I would say on the back of that, we're talking about three-phase electricity supplies. On larger dwellings, a lot of air source heat pumps, for example, will necessitate a three-phase supply. And, certainly in the UK and quite possibly further afield, I think, again, there's a general, almost, it's just slipping under the radar that a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate that. You really need to understand what supply you might have into the building now and what supply you might have in the future if you're going for an all-electric setup over a gas setup.
I mean, that would suggest to me that going back to the same conversation about heat pumps, that really we need to look at making the buildings lean first before we look at changing how we provide that energy. I wanted to go back to Richard's question, the element about new build, because I think that I think so. Timber is a very interesting point to make, and it's a very fashionable phrase to use to consider. But I mean, I think sort of timber is sort of as a material is fine, but also particularly if we're talking about multi-story buildings, brings in a lot of other questions. If we're talking multiple occupancy, large buildings, fire becomes a concern and needs to be managed in a considered way. I think the things we need to be looking at more the natural sort of direction towards off-site, which obviously with very large providers within this hospitality industry are already one of the leaders in off-site construction, in volumetric construction. It's not just quick and easy and people associate it with the ubiquity of building very quickly. It also allows you to build to a far higher quality and waste far little. You might have potentially a third sort of 33% of the wasted material compared to the building on site. So things like that, which might have a higher cost, would achieve a far greater product once installed, a higher quality product. And the other thing is, if you can't, having said that the greenest building is the one that you already have earlier, if the building you've got really isn't adaptable, really can't be made to work. The other things that are really interesting, I think in Holland, this is probably the leaders in this, is actually cataloguing and cataloguing any buildings which are demolished, and rather than put the arisings into landfill, any materials are being reused, whether it's crushed within aggregates, or actually physically reusing materials, timbers, bricks, whatever. And I think that's a really interesting thing. So if you, having explored ways of keeping existing buildings, and if it proves impossible, you can still look at reusing some of your materials, which have a huge benefit because of the sequestered carbon already within the existing fabric.
Yeah, if I can just add a couple of points there. I've got a question for Mark actually first. Is there an easy way to actually determine the heat and the seepage out of the building, or how efficient the building is as it currently is without any changes? Is it a straightforward thing to do, or is it one of those things that requires significant site surveys and a lot of time to actually determine?
Building fabric is relatively easy if the construction details are known. So if you know what your wall makeup is, for example, whether it's a brick skin, cavity, insulation, whatever that construction makeup is, you can work out the heat loss parameters for each of the individual elements. The hardest element to quantify will be the physical air infiltration of that building. Now, you can undertake an air test to it, and that will tell you what the exact value is. But in most instances, with an occupied building, that won't be possible. So there's, effectively, it's going to have to be a best estimate value to sort of look at that in the wider calculation. But certainly the actual building fabric values for the wall makeup, roofs, floors, windows, doors, yeah, you can certainly get a pretty good picture just from looking at those.
And one of the things that I had to handle was that across the portfolio that we were actually implementing, there were existing properties as well, but every building seemed to have its own set of heating standards and heating methods, and trying to be consistent is actually incredibly difficult, especially with systems. And one of the biggest problems I found was actually in a building that was actually had underfloor heating. Of all the buildings we had, that was the most problematic, because the heat was being retained in the water when you thought, well, actually, you've implemented a system that says no more heat required, but the heat was still there. And that then results in people opening windows, and you bring in, they demand air conditioning on top of all the rest of all the other things. So these are the issues with some of the existing buildings that will still be in place. And I was wondering, do you have any ideas about how, or what are the sort of solutions or approaches that people should take to dealing with those sort of problems?
I think certainly with things like underfloor heating, most people are used to either air heating or a wet radiator system. If you're talking about a residential or something like that, certainly in the UK, a lot of people have a gas combi boiler or gas system boiler and wet radiators. Underfloor heating works in a very, very slow manner, and therefore, probably directly with your experience of that, people don't really appreciate, or the end user don't really appreciate how the system works. They have a very slow heat up time, they have a very slow deheat time, whereas a wet radiator system that operates at much higher temperatures, you turn the heating off, the radiators get cool quite quickly, and there's that perception that the heating is off and everything's at a comfortable level. So what you tend to find with slow reacting systems, they're very, very efficient when they're left on their own, but people have a habit of interfacing with them. They think they're not heating up quick enough, so they just knock the thermostat up another degree, or it's not cooling down quick enough, they just knock the thermostat down a degree. And of course the knock-on effect of that is an hour later it's cooler or hotter than what they was expecting, so then they go and tweak the system again. So I'm not saying that that's going to apply to all instances, but there's it's almost a degree of education to the end user, to particularly where new systems are being brought in, and that's going to be super important going forwards, where in the UK but globally, air source heat pumps are being pushed everywhere we go. They do operate differently. If you're used to a gas-fired system, an air source heat pump system does operate very, very differently. It works at lower temperatures. Your heating system will be different. There is an education process to go with this, this movement into new technologies.
Yeah, one of the things that we did was, because this is 10 years ago. To be honest, no one was really, yes, the planning requirements required net zero thinking and so on. But I know from an IT perspective and a systems perspective, much of the thinking was about reducing the operating cost of the building. So a lot of it was based around, if people aren't in the units, switch off the energy or reduce the energy requirements so that they're not building up costs with effectively in empty units. In terms of actually a lot of I'm sure many of your audience where they have service departments, many of them have leases on those apartments. They don't have control over the build in some ways. Are there things that, and they may be involved in refurbishments? Yeah. So are there things that they can do within the refurbishment program that doesn't necessarily impact the infrastructure of the building, but might help reduce the actual costs of running the actual energy, reducing the energy cost?
I think a lot of it is down to better controls. There's the end user of the building, and I know if the building's not in use, there's a sort of, let's just switch everything off and it will be fine sort of approach. But there's always, you've got to have frost protection, so you want to have systems in place to keep a low heat cycle running through and bits and pieces. Even the most simplistic controls now enable remote interfacing. So whether that's on an end tenant or an end user basis, or if it's a managed building, managed departments or something like that, it can all be brought together as a central thing. So I know we sort of talk about BMS, and BMS is a central operating system for a building, but now BMS is so much more than that, because it's almost a decentralized central operating system. So many people can have access to it. It's an app on your phone, it's an app on your tablet, and it's it's just a system of writing protocols as to who has access to what facets of that system. But it's it's basically software driven now, and I think that's the new systems going in place, the management will be picked up in that.
I think part of your question you asked earlier, Raj, which I thought was really good, but also really difficult, is standardization. Because if we're all working with their existing buildings, and there is no standard answer in construction. One of the reasons that it's so expensive to work in construction with these existing buildings is because it's almost a prototype every time you work with an existing site and with different kind of regulatory contexts and things. So I think what's quite clever about the comparison with a leasehold property where you have limited scope to play with the fabric is actually, by intelligently managing your buildings, at least you can understand where the issues are, where the low-hanging fruit are, and you can start to prioritize where you actually make changes. And then in terms of actually making changes, really, people, there will be compromises. There is going to be intervention. It is going to take time. It's going to take money, and it is going to take buildings offline. But I think where we're in our refurbishment projects, so using the example of this hotel, I don't know if you can see a model just above my head, it's a heritage building which we're extending, and it's going to be a sort of boutique hotel. In order to maintain all of the historic features, which in our case, to our advantage, are largely external, we're really building almost an entirely new building inside of it. And actually this sort of insulating within the inside of a building, using the right products, detailed properly, so you're not creating problems with interstitial condensation or anything like that arising later on. That's probably the most practical solution available to most people, and you can actually achieve a very high level of performance, but it's at the sacrifice of floor area, or it's just a sacrifice of losing interior detailing. It might be at the sacrifice of losing some internal character. So you have to pick and choose about when you do it. There are some really interesting products out there, things like wood wool based products, which also add thermal mass, and they can be relatively thin. So if you don't want to lose a lot of space, you can. There's a product we use which is 22 mil or just shy of an inch thick for non-metric watches. If you lined out a building with that, okay, it provides a certain amount of additional resistance to the loss of, well, the transfer of heat across the fabric of the building, but it also allows you to create an airtight inner layer to the building as well. And the upside of that also is you have the increase, or you start to manage the difference in temperature, or the perceived temperature difference from the inside wall and the outside wall, which is this idea of thermal comfort is the thing that drives what a person in a hotel room drives them to either turn the heating up, turn the heating down, open the window, and do all of these things which can play havoc with your management of the building. But if you can keep the temperature within the room more stable for longer, because insulated without actually introducing heat, you can reduce your burden on it as well. But so there is no standardized solution, but there are lots of interesting products going out there, and I think that we'll probably see more take up in particular areas, and it might become less unique, but it's always going to be, to a degree, site specific with existing buildings, I think.
Thank you very much, everyone. Raj, sorry for that. If I could just jump in.
I was just about to ask a question, actually. So,
Raj, ask the question after because we're way behind time with the video. So, won't be a minute. Right, forgive me for that, Raj. I was just very, very keen to get the sponsors video rolled before we finish. What I'd like to say, so if you ask the question, and but then after that question and answer, if I could please put on the screen some of the comments and questions from the audience, and then we'll go on to further questions. So over to you, Raj.
So the question I had really, you might remember I said that we had a continuous improvement program when we were actually designing out the buildings. And one of the things that was actually in the continuous improvement program was to actually use what I call Nagios interfaces to actually measure exactly how much energy was being used by each individual apartment. And the idea was to actually, for anyone who's using more than a certain amount, that we could then charge them and actually charge them automatically. Now, I mean, we're now being asked to do that across the board, actually, and finally, we think we might have a solution. But the point is that that measurement of the energy requirement on a per on the basis of being able to charge for it has actually changed the business idea of some of the people. So what they're saying is, we don't need to be net zero. We don't actually need to do a lot of these things, because if people are charged for the additional usage, their habits will change and they'll end up using less energy. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, with some of the ideas going forward, yes, if in terms of especially with existing buildings, if the emphasis is on changing behavior of individuals, does that then sort of can a company say, well, we're achieving net zero by changing the behavior of the customers that we have?
It's a great point, isn't it? That's sort of like demand driven. But yeah, over to. So I think Mark, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that will reduce the overall building energy demand by virtue of the fact that people are naturally using less energy within it. In terms of needing to do, I don't know, sort of consequential improvements or part of your refurbishment program, I think there's always going to be a demand from that, and I suspect that much as we have a sort of similar system here in the UK where we need to display sort of a display energy performance certificate for sort of public buildings, I suspect there might be something similar coming in for the zero carbon future that we're all aiming for. And although your energy consumption will naturally reduce, there will still be a base building load. There will be a base building energy consumption, and there's probably still going to be a prerequisite to address some of the sort of fundamental uses that go on there. I don't know, Jamie, you got something as well?
I was going to add. I was just thinking about this idea of sort of comparing. I think there's always going to be this sense that it's about the building and not about how we use the building, and it really is about both, and it will be both regulatory and it will be both in terms of the burden from the cost on the building owners. I mean, I think it's, if you look at the way that facilities management industry works at the moment, where performance and pay is managed on by an asset database. Be it the maintenance or the replacement of an asset database. Going forward, it seems entirely feasible to me that FM services, facilities management services, will be as much about managing the energy consumption of a building as it is about the maintenance of the assets. And actually, you could actually see where performance could be pegged against that as well. So you start to get this, and then that's enabled by this much more intelligent process, much more data, this much broader data model that we're going to have available of our buildings. So it doesn't matter that our buildings could be, easily they could be 900 years old in Europe. They could be, they could be the most modern buildings as well. So it doesn't really matter. As long as we have the data on it, we can create targets and improvements and manage in an intelligent way. And I think that we need to sort of come away from this kind of quite sort of prosaic idea that building management is about, when a light bulb goes, it gets replaced. It should be about this progression towards an incentivized progression towards a lower carbon future as well, and that would pay dividends for both building owners and the companies managing them.
Fantastic, thank you. At this stage, I would like to post a few comments and questions from the audience, and I apologise to the individuals for having taken so long. I think we may have even answered one of the questions that was posted, but yeah, Joe, I didn't realise that you were even there when I did the shout out. But Joe Webb from Lamington, to read our whole carbon net zero roadmap here, and then Joe's given the URL, and where are we? And our room 2 in Chiswick, the world's first whole life carbon net zero hotel, and the URL there. Joe, if you're still in the audience, actually no, you can't post as a copy and paste, I don't think, but the others in the audience will be able to copy those URLs. Hopefully they've been on those sufficiently for them to have made a note. Jamie from Mississippi. Hi, Jamie, and thanks. I got your message there. Thank you. With many apartments, especially in Asia, that have utility caps and overages. Is that a word? Have to be paid. Okay. This does create an awareness of utilities used by the occupants. So I think, thanks, Jamie, and I think that was the kind of what was being discussed in that latest question and comments, wasn't it? And Veronica, quite a long time ago, asked a question, and I think we've subsequently answered it, but correct me if I'm wrong. Building design is important. I'd be interested in the panelist views on the implications for net zero with existing stock buildings. What do you see as the way forward for refurbishment of buildings? I don't know. I think we've probably answered that, but is there a recap that somebody would kindly like to offer? So with refurbishment of buildings, let me put it. Is it not just the? Well, so we are refurbishing. We've talked about the heat pumps, and we've talked about, perhaps increased use of wood. I have a couple of questions, really. Is there one type of wood that's preferable to another? And is this going to cause havoc with fire regulations going forward? Does anybody want to make a comment on that?
I don't think. I mean, wood is great in sort of new build constructions, and I think how it fits within the regional fire regulations will differ wildly. I think that I'm not sure if there's sort of a slight confusion. The reference I made to refurbishment work was using wood pulp type products, which as an alternative to plastic-based insulations, because you can have sort of air-blown wood pulp insulations, which it says a waste product. It's inherently green in that it's already got sequestered carbon within it, but also it brings with it a thermal mass. Because I think the things that you actually have to play with in an existing building are air tightness, insulation, and thermal mass. They're the three things that you can play with, and then once you've sort of modeled those, that's when you can then look at, Mark and I were talking about earlier, the limited benefits of improving the technology behind the heating and cooling. If you're not dealing with those issues first, you've got to make the buildings lean first.
Right, thank you. With regard to kind of net zero compliance and what have you, is there any aspect of the companies with whom a property or a building works, it basically supply chain? Is supply chain involved in becoming net zero? So could I have a fantastic new building, but actually the people that are supplying me are abusing the planet, but I'm still okay? So how does that work, please?
that's exactly the devil in the detail that will be probably have some regional variation, but absolutely it should have. I mean, I think the idea of this development of the carbon signature of a building should take into consideration, as I've mentioned, I think a number of times, not just the static state of the building, but how it's used as well. So, and that I think you should, in the same way that procurement now will legally allow central government to procure based on locality as well. Whereas before it was always about a level playing field, but now you can actually build an argument that by sourcing things locally, it's sustainable, both economically as well as being environmentally sustainable. So I think it's something which always surprises me that you can, at the moment where we were still waiting for some of the legislation to fall into places, that you can make claims of being very high performing, very low energy use building, but I don't know, let's think. You could look at the comparisons in the car industry and batteries, and where the materials come to provide those, and whether that the embodied carbon. So it has to be a whole picture, and it will be a whole picture.
Also, if we just add the supply chain now, suppliers are actually being encouraged to show what they are doing in terms of net zero, and this is across all industries. I don't think this is just for hospitality. I mean, I know in IT there's a lot of emphasis on companies demonstrating that they are, or they at least have a plan to net zero. I mean, one thinks about, obviously the bigger companies are being asked to ensure that all their energy is being provided in a renewable manner. But this emphasis is so significant that I think it's almost as though there'll come a point quite soon, if you haven't got a plan and you aren't actually net zero, you will stick out like a sore thumb, because you won't be able to answer even the most basic questions that will be asked, I think, of all suppliers.
Just a very quick expansion is, it's exactly that. You can't just focus purely on the building and the running emissions of that building from the day it's constructed for a new build. It's very much, a lot of focus is shifting onto the construction and the manufacture and the materials that are within that, the cost of the carbon to manufacture the elements that are going to that building, the cost of the emissions and the embedded carbon in everything that's in there. And then that carbon needs to be offset somewhere along the line. Now, whether that's during construction or it's during end use. I mean, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but someone might say, we planted 10 trees and we've offset X amount of carbon for this, bit of steel that we've had to put in. But it's starting to look much further afield at that kind of element and technology and systems to really look at everything that's involved with procurement, the delivering of the materials to site, the construction of that building, and then finally the end use, which is now only one facet of the overall emission cycle.
Talking about trees there, Mark, you've almost persuaded me not to get a Christmas tree now, in case I get a knock at the door. I'm responsible for having had one Christmas tree not cut down. But yeah, it's
just plant another one.
That's the answer, is it? Just constable. Good idea. I mean, we've gone over the 1 hour, and I'm not sure whether people have time to go a little further. I mean, I'd like to throw in a few things, please, that we may not have touched on. Some of it we have, but questions. First of all, this is going to be quite confusing, but furniture within properties. So I'm thinking now in terms of hospitality, and how can the people watching this who are involved in hospitality and providing accommodation, they don't often own the buildings. We will have apart hotel managers, but otherwise it's kind of a form of rent to rent. So can they improve their net zero kind of status compliance by the type of furniture that's involved, that they use? And is there one, if so, is there one suggestion that you would give to those operators on how to get on the road towards net zero compliance? What would be your main suggestion? We've talked about heat pumps, and I'm kind of like looking at them like they're reverse air conditioning almost. They're getting rid of I don't know, but over to whoever would like to pick up on that. What advice would you give to the rent, so service department providers who rent in and then provide short-term lets? How do they get on the road to this?
I mean, with the R2R market, I mean, surely they're a customer. They're renting a building. And I think that actually they'll see themselves. They should see themselves as that. And if their customers are demanding a greener product, even if you look at business travelers as an example, where a company has a policy of achieving net zero, they would then look to their supply chain and the services they buy, and therefore in the services that you provide as a rent-to-rent offer, you can then you should be turning to your landlords and say, well, look, your building isn't providing what my customers need anymore, and that's a case for you to either have a conversation with them about upgrading or potentially lowering in the short term, lowering the rent, because the market will speak, right? I mean, we'll have some impact on it. I think I think that's probably more powerful than necessarily fixtures and fittings, although we would always urge that investment in good quality, robust fixtures and fittings will pay off in the long run anyway, and also design-wise it will pay off. I think short-termism is probably short-term fashion is not particularly good for style or for the sense of quality. But that aside, I mean, to answer the question about one thing you do, data, understand how your buildings operate now. And use because if you don't know what they do or the energy they use, it's very difficult for you to benchmark any improvements and understand where you can make the savings in the future.
Right, thanks, Jamie. Mention data, and I always think Raj. So over to you, Raj. My next question was going to be regarding technology, and are there technologies? We talked earlier about that kind of the managing and juggling with the temperature, and I'm a devil for that. We've got a Nest, and I'm constantly it's bad news if that leaf appears, because it means I'm going to freeze very shortly. But yeah, over to you, Ryan.
I want to go back to the first question first. I'll answer that as well. Just in terms of first steps, I think a lot depends on the size of your portfolio, to be honest. I think the approach of a larger organization, it's over a longer period of time. What I would say is that one of the things that I had to do, I mean, remember we're building 9 buildings, it was 1,000 apartments, etc., etc. One of the things that I had to do in terms of starting that project around the IT side and managing the building systems, I shared with the owner my experiences of working in telecoms where infrastructure was built and other industries. And one of the key things you got to accept at the beginning is you got to have somebody in charge who actually is a direct report to either the board or the owner. And upfront, you got to understand you might need to change a supplier. So as you're actually working towards your goals, you will have to mitigate for all kinds of things. You need to have plans in place that if a company is not delivering, you should be able to replace them without affecting the end date of your delivery. So I would say that sort of thought process helps you then work out the steps you need to take and helps you understand how to gauge, are your suppliers doing well in terms of getting you to where you want to get to? Okay, so it's the kind of fundamentals of program management. When you're smaller, what I would say is, and by smaller, less than 100 apartments that are in different areas, not in just a single building, but in different areas, I would say actually take the route of least paying. I think lighting is something that you should really think about. We know that we know that certain bulbs are not going to be available. Start now putting in the quality bulbs and start a refurbishment program, even around sort of basic things. So as if you're going to have somebody leaving, there's a week there, do something in that week that could actually assist, because at the end of the day, even if you take a year to get there, or 2 years, it's a lot easier if you're doing stuff piecemeal than having to sort of find the funds up front and do it as one big refurbishment over a month or 2 months. So, and part of that thinking should be about how you do the wiring. I mean, Jamie's just mentioned about RFPs. One of the things that we did, we actually, on the larger projects, we actually sent out RFPs to quite a lot of organizations. I then did a shortlisting. Once we did the shortlisting, I actually met with the actual people who ran those businesses, reported back to the owner, and we actually put in lots of mitigation on every single contract. Every single contract, we put lots of mitigation. So to give you an example, there was one company from Israel that was fantastic, and they were providing brilliant wireless systems. The mitigation I put in was that if they didn't deliver to a certain standard, or we had any issues, I could actually replace them without any penalties whatsoever. And then we'd end up doing that. It wasn't their fault. There was a construction problem. And this is one of the things that I think that people should understand when they're doing refurbishments and looking at materials. They need to talk to people like Mark and Jamie, because some of these materials, they look fantastic, they sound fantastic, but sometimes they're so dense in their nature in terms of the material itself, you'll find Wi-Fi signals won't get through them. You'll find other issues that suddenly arise out of the blue that affect your customers in a way that you would never have expected. So it's really important to have those discussions as part of the process of any sort of refurbishment now, if you're trying to actually reduce the energy consumption of your apartments and your portfolio. In terms of technologies, there's actually lots of technology, but I think it comes down to what are you trying to achieve as a business? As I've said, now we're being called into now put the payment system directly linking it to energy consumption to change behavior. I think if the recording information is actually not as easy as people might think, but it's a discipline, and you need to have that discipline put into your operational processes. And as Jamie said, if you can sort of understand from the data your profile, you'll then understand where best to start. And I think that comes, and that is really some of the first steps that need to be taken. I think too many people assume it's a simple thing. And I think with one thing I've learned is it's not a simple thing. So that's what I'd say.
Thanks, Raj. Thank you. Sorry, Mark, we've kind of lost you in the picture there, but we'll get you back in a minute. Yeah, Jamie made a comment there. I noticed that solar panels haven't been mentioned in the US. A lot of buildings and homes are running all hot water solely from solar panels, which greatly reduces electrical or gas output, and you can get tax credits by doing this. Maybe there isn't enough sun in the UK. Boy. But would anybody like to comment on that? Not the sun in the UK, but solar panels.
I think I mean we're in the southeast so it's the weather's perfectly good down here for them. But I think I've got some comments, but I'm happy for Mark to go first on that.
Yeah, I mean, generally, when we sort of model the buildings here in the UK, a lot of the solar thermal you're talking about, the generation of hot water from sunlight, it's very much project dependent, and if you've got a good base load, so it can work for hotels, it works for leisure centres, swimming pools, that kind of thing. We've either got a large body of hot water to be maintained, i.e. a swimming pool, there's a lot of showers in use with a leisure centre, hotels that have got sort of a high turnover, so solar thermal is quite a good sort of system. However, it doesn't tend to work for other buildings such as schools and bits and pieces, and we quite often find it's not particularly great for our residential market, mainly because of when the hot water demand doesn't necessarily dovetail in with when that generation is from the available sunlight. I mean, yeah, definitely in the UK, sunlight could be better sometimes, especially if you're not in the southeast, such as where we are. But generally, when we do our energy modelling, we tend to find that the roof space is better optimised with solar photovoltaics, i.e. the generation of electricity, rather than hot water. That electricity could then be used to go into an electric immersion to provide hot water, but it just, maybe it's our limited availability of sunlight hours in this country that certainly anything outside the middle of summer, it's not really a great system for us. Appreciably in Asia, the Americas, certainly in Southern Europe as well, you sort of travel around and you see an awful lot of individual houses with solar thermal systems on the roof rather than electricity, and to us it's a little bit alien, but it just suits them with the enhanced daylight hours. Yeah, I don't know, Jamie, if you want to sort of add to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously there are better places to take advantage of solar than the UK, but I also think that scale is often a big thing. We're seeing, I mean, the rapid advances, and I'm sure we'll see more advances, particularly when it's better integrated within building fabric. I think that I look out the window and we've got a large client based opposite our office, and they've recently installed 2 very large arrays on their buildings, but even so, the energy payback on them is still getting on for 10 years. It's pretty intrusive, and so there are lower hanging fruit, I suppose, is the thing. And I'm going to sound like a sort of a naysayer on this, but certainly in climates temperate climates like the UK, I think there are lower hanging fruit to look at than solar right now. But that's not to say that there are not going to be more opportunities in the future. But I also think that we're going to see much more advances in sort of solar farming, and then actually accessing your electricity via that rather than micro production necessarily, I think, in the UK. But obviously, yes, in where you're blessed with better climate, there's a lot more advantage to be gained.
Yeah, in fact, I'm in the loft here, and it's just started raining in West London, and you've got me thinking. I might get my thinking cap on and start thinking about rain hydropower or something like that, because we don't get much sun, but we must be able to tap the energy from the rain. Who knows? But we've gone over, and thank you so much, panel, for discussing and offering your insights into this topic that is here. Thankfully, it's necessary to stay. So thank you very much for your very valuable time. I would like to, before we play the outro video and what have you, perhaps go around the panel with anything that we may have omitted from the discussion that you'd very much like to mention, or otherwise to mention again, please, your company names, and whether there is a certain aspect of your business that you can where you can assist the audience directly or indirectly, but Raj, because you're familiar with the group and the audience, perhaps may I turn to you first, please?
I think the one thing that we should take away is you need to have a plan for this. I think everybody should. We all have business plans. We all understand the need for a business plan. It's really important that everybody put a little bit of effort into putting in a plan. I would argue, base it on reducing your energy costs to a minimum, and from that build out the ideas of how to get to net zero. I've actually looked at quite a lot of stuff in terms of what would be considered a net zero company. Honestly, so construction is easier to define at the moment than just about any other industry from my perspective. I could argue Avquest are a net zero company, but the most important thing is you might be net zero today. It doesn't mean it's say a net zero tomorrow. And I think that plan and the idea of having a continuous improvement plan is pretty fundamental now. That is actually what's going to get you there more than anything else.
So, thank you, Raj. Mark, perhaps may I turn to you?
Yeah, I think us as a company, we primarily design MEP systems. We do the thermal modeling and the calculating. We'll be working certainly with people like Jamie to understand the buildings and get systems in place to suit them. But I suspect Jamie might say something similar almost, but it doesn't matter if it's a new construction project or a refurbishment or retrofit of an existing building. In limiting the energy use of that building, it needs to start with the building itself and not the systems within it. By making the building as thermally efficient as possible, by making the air infiltration as low as possible, reducing solar gains in summer to reduce the need for cooling, enhancing if possible solar gains in winter, so using south facing windows with shading, etc. Playing with the orientation, certainly if it's a new build, but making the building work for you is key, and then the systems, the M&E systems within that will follow suit, and they will be designed around minimal input into the building, and your emissions will naturally be considerably lower due to that. If the building's doing the hard work for you by being super efficient to start with, then your additional energy use on top of that in terms of electricity to run M&E systems will be greatly reduced.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. And Jamie, over to you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Mark predicted, I agree. We have a phrase we use a lot in the office of lean, mean, and then green. So you look at kind of making sure that the building doesn't demand a lot of energy, making sure the building doesn't waste much energy, and then the last thing you look at is the green thing, because the green thing is often the expensive, might be the thing that gives you the best optics, but it wouldn't necessarily be the thing that's going to give you the best performance for the pound invested. I think that looking at being energy efficient first is far more important. I had a conversation with a client the other day, really big organization, and I had an introduction from one of the sort of senior managers to one of the directors saying, "Oh, you really get on because you're both really into sustainability." And I sort of made a sort of flippant remark about kind of like being into sustainability is a bit like being into gravity kind of thing. It should just be what we're doing. Let's stop thinking about it as a thing. It's everything that we do now in our businesses. And I think strategy as well, Shez, is really key. I think it's difficult. Existing buildings is difficult, and I think that you need to, I would say this, I would say, you need to have the right team of consultants to make sure you can work with existing buildings. Now, if you want to get in touch with Raj, I'm sure he could put you in touch with some that we could help you out. But it's not going to be easy, but it's not something that anybody should avoid. It's universal to all of us.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's such a, like you say, really, it's kind of, it's all encompassing, and so it's not just a topic. It is the world that that we've got to work towards if we going to save this planet. If I can enter into some cliches, but one more quick question, perhaps, around or for anybody. Some may not have anything to answer on this one, but is there something when you're walking down the street or you're doing something or other where you're thinking, which really is there something that we do that we're not thinking about enough, like ordering, I don't know, really ordering food from the supermarket, and you've got like these trucks going around all over the place just because he's too lazy to get out and go to the supermarket. Something like that. Is there anything that really bugs you that what we're doing at the moment? Not necessarily to do with architecture, but how can we make the planet more green?
I'm a huge advocate of walking. When you visit a new city, walk around it, and you see a lot more. You enjoy the journey as well as the destination. You learn a lot more incidental, and it's green and a better quality experience as well. Meet new people, get lost as well.
What me?
You can get lost. That was you to be at all of us. Yeah. It enjoyable.
I mean, the only thing that really bugs me, to be honest, and it does bug me like you wouldn't believe, are the 20 mile per hour speed limits. anyone who knows anything about sort of petrol cars knows that the lower the gear, and you're stuck doing nothing, you end up wasting more petrol than ever before. And I think that's part of it is we need to start actually understanding, what is consuming energy and behavior that actually, in the old days, it used to be when you leave the room, switch off the light. It was ingrained in a lot of. I still remember at school, you got to switch off the light when you leave the room. I don't think many people think like that nowadays, and I think that maybe by understanding the energy that we're using, we get a better appreciation of how to deal with many of the questions that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Mark, have we covered everything, do you think?
I was just going to say there's a lot of sort of thought that renewables are the answer to everything. So we get a building in place, put the systems in, and then chuck a load of photovoltaics on it, or whatever the end system might be, and then that will get us over the line, and we've got a compliant building, and everyone's happy. But renewables aren't the answer. The building needs to be designed right to start with, and whether it's a retrofit or a new build, get the building right first. It's very annoying if you see a building, it's plastered with solar panels, and they're shouting about it and going, yeah, we're super green, we've got our compliant building, and you sort of have to ask the question and go, yeah, but have you put those on there because the building's basically rubbish and you need all of that, or are you actually going over and above, and now you're doing your bit for the the environment, because that system on your roof is now just providing green energy. You've now got a negative energy building. It's just little bugbears like that where I think there's too much reliance on just chuck renewables, make it okay. It's just make it right to start with, and then add renewables as an over extra.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark, Jamie, Raj. It's been. I could ask questions till the cows come home, but I better not. So thank you very much indeed to fantastic panel for discussing such an important topic. So thank you very much. Thank you also to the audience who tuned in live, and to those who watched the broadcast. I will now play an outro video, and once more, thank you to everybody.